as something that you'll utilize every day with a ventilator, you should have a good idea of what PEEP is, and that's positive end expiratory pressure. Basically, the goal here is to increase your FRC. So you're going to leave positive pressure inside your alveoli at the end of your expiratory period. And because there will be pressure in these alveoli, they will retain some volume, and that will have benefits for you. Now, there's both natural or auto PEEP, which can happen with asthma and breath stacking, or there's extrinsic PEEP, which is what we're applying with the ventilator. And certainly a little bit of PEEP from the ventilator is a good thing, but you can imagine situations where having a lot of pressure left over in your alveoli at the end of your expiratory phase in asthma, where this causes big problems. There is a range of acceptable PEEP, and then also amounts of PEEP that are potentially dangerous as well. By maintaining some amount of positive pressure inside this alveoli at the end of your expiratory period, you'll prevent the alveoli from collapsing and reopening with every breath. So this decreases the shear stress on the alveoli. I mentioned that above, and this should decrease the amount of injury that a ventilator is causing on your lungs. This also has the added benefit of decreasing atelectasis. Atelectasis being these clusters of collapsed alveoli, and when we have positive pressure, they will be stented open, and therefore you'll have less collapsed lung tissue. Let me draw out this pulmonary compliance curve to show how we can optimize our lung compliance by utilizing PEEP. On the x-axis, we'll have pressure, y-axis, volume. At very low lung volumes, you have low compliance, so it'll take lots of pressure to expand your lungs from the empty state, or from a collapsed alveoli state. And then you have a better compliance in this sort of mid-filling range of your lungs, and then as your lungs become more full, your compliance decreases again. When you exhale from a ventilator, the pressure in your lungs will drop and the volume in your lungs will drop. And as the pressure approaches zero, you'll be left with very low lung volumes. And I guess they won't actually go to zero. You'll be left with some amount of air in your lungs, and that is your functional residual capacity. But you'll have very low volume left in your lungs when your pressure is zero. I'm just going to draw a line basically at zero here, which is what would happen if you had no PEEP. So this low pressure and very low lung volume becomes the new starting point of your next breath. Let's say that we give a predetermined positive pressure breath to this patient of this magnitude. We'll find that it doesn't take us very far up in terms of volumes. That's because right now we're operating on this low compliance part of the pressure volume curve of your lungs. And basically this high pressure that you're applying is doing things like going towards re-expanding collapsed alveoli, and you're not getting very good actual alveolar expansion in this part of the curve. Let's let this patient exhale, and this time we'll add PEEP. So instead of allowing the pressure to drop all the way to zero, we'll only let it get this far. So we have PEEP on board now. So this becomes our new starting pressure, and this is a little bit higher in terms of our starting volumes, which means that we have a higher functional residual capacity and a higher pressure at the beginning of our next breath for this person. Let's deliver now a positive pressure breath of this same magnitude, only starting at this point. So I'm just trying to make this line the same size as this one. Now we're going to get much better volume returns because we are now on this part of the curve where we have better compliance. So even though our driving pressure is the same, driving pressure is basically your final total pressure minus your starting pressure between your first breath here with no PEEP and our second breath here where we have PEEP, our second breath is giving us much better volumes, which is a much better situation to be in. Basically what I'm saying is that you can use PEEP to bring your functional residual capacity up to a point where for any given pressure that you use on your ventilator, you're going to get better lung expansion. What you might notice is technically you could use 0 PEEP and allow this airway pressure to drop to 0 and start at very low lung volumes and then give the same total amount of pressure all in one breath to bring you up to this same point on your pressure volume curve. And yes, this would give you technically the same lung volume with the same total pressure, but then we still have to go through this range of opening up closed alveoli with every single breath, which will increase the shear stress on them because they're going to be collapsing and snapping open every time that the ventilator gives a breath. So if we can avoid this part of collapsing and re-expanding the lungs with every breath, then we're going to do less damage to lungs with our ventilator. So we use the PEEP to hold us basically above this range here, and then we can use a lower driving pressure to achieve good lung expansion for breathing. So PEEP is definitely a good thing, but it is possible to have excessive PEEP as well. And then we start to have issues with pulmonary compliance again, where your pulmonary compliance is decreased at excessive levels of PEEP. And this should be relatively intuitive if you think of each alveoli like a balloon, which they are not exactly like, but it certainly works to think of them like this. A fully inflated balloon is going to have very low compliance. So if we fully expand our lung volumes using very high pressures, and then we try to somehow squeeze even more volume into them, it's just not going to work. There is definitely a finite amount of air that you can fit into somebody's lungs. So if you deliver an excessive amount of positive end expiratory pressure, we may be holding someone's FRC up at a very high volume like this. And then by giving a breath to this person, we actually get very minimal volume returns with this breath. So it wouldn't make any sense to have someone's PEEP way up here when this is what their compliance curve looks like. Excessive PEEP also increases your dead space and increases the amount of work that your right ventricle needs to do. Let me show you that. Here's a slice of your right ventricle, which is going to be pumping blood through your pulmonary circulation. And we've narrowed things down to the pulmonary capillaries here working their way through alveoli. And if all of these alveoli have very high pressures in them, it's going to be squeezing down on this capillary, and we can get into a situation where our alveolar pressure is greater than the pressure in our arterial blood flow, which is obviously higher than our venous outflow. And this is the definition of zone 1 of the west zones, which is dead space. The pressure in these alveoli is so high that we can't get any blood flow through this point. So all of this ventilation is essentially wasted because we're not actually perfusing the capillaries around these alveoli with super high pressure in them. Then the other part of that is that since your right ventricle is trying to force blood through all these high pressure capillaries, which are competing with your high pressured alveoli. Your right ventricle has to do more work to generate high pressures to try to force blood through this high pressure system now. Remember that under normal circumstances or just regular breathing, the pulmonary circulation is a low pressure circuit, whereas now when we're introducing a high amount of positive pressure into these alveoli, then we start to squish down on these capillaries in a very unnatural way. Finally, I want to mention recruitment maneuvers, which you can use to basically reinflate collapsed alveoli, or if you're suspicious that you have atelectasis, then you can use this to try to re-recruit the alveoli which are de-recruited. There are many ways to do this, but I think the simplest is 30 for 30 to 40 centimeters of water. Hold for 30 seconds. So basically to do this, you would just put the vent on manspont with the APL at whatever pressure you're trying to target here and leave it there for 30 seconds. There are also vent procedures that you can do, and this will basically step up your PEEP with successive breaths until your PEEP is very high, maybe 20 or 30, and then it will lower your PEEP down again. And you just have to find that on your particular vent and see if it exists. It's maybe a more elegant way of doing a recruitment maneuver. The problem with this 30-second hold at 30 to 40 centimeters of water is that this is actually fairly intense, especially for these hemodynamic effects that we were just talking about. So this definitely will cause hypotension. And the degree of hypotension that you get is going to be related to the cardiovascular status of that patient. So if you get someone who is not doing so well otherwise, they may not be able to tolerate this recruitment maneuver, and you'd have to be very careful, especially if you don't have an arterial line to monitor what's happening with their blood pressure while you do it. These are also much higher pressures than you would consider using in someone who just had their lung operated on. Not to say that you'll be expected to manage those cases until further on in residency, but there's not necessarily a great one-size-fits-all recipe for a recruitment maneuver, but the 30 for 30 is at least something you'll find in textbooks, and acknowledging that it can cause hypotension and tachycardia and transient worsening of your hypoxemia, this is at least a reasonable template for your recruitment maneuver. I guess I'm assuming you know this, but atelectasis causes hypoxemia, and specifically that is shunting. So if you're increasing your FiO2 and it doesn't seem to be helping much with your hypoxemia, perhaps atelectasis is your issue, and it'd be very reasonable to try a recruitment maneuver. So if you have shunting and hypoxemia, this would be one of your first steps in troubleshooting that. There's also an argument to be made about routinely doing a recruitment maneuver at the end of surgery, particularly with abdominal surgeries where you're expecting some degree of basilar atelectasis despite the use of PEEP. So that's also something that can be considered.